January 1887. The cold had tightened its grip around the Medicine Bow foothills for 6 straight days. Snow raced across the open ground in white sheets. Wind hammered fences flat. Temperatures had fallen below 40 degrees under zero. Every road had vanished beneath drifts taller than a man's waist. A small group from the settlement fought their way through the storm, shoveling and clearing a narrow path through the snow. At the far end of a hillside stood a low stone cabin, dark, heavy, half buried against the slope. People had laughed at that cabin all autumn. They had called it the tomb. Most were certain the family inside had frozen days ago. Then the door opened. Warm air rolled out into the killing cold. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They simply stared, because the one place everyone expected to become a grave was somehow the only place that still felt alive. The sight of that warm doorway had begun long before the storm. The previous winter, Dorian Vale was 37 years old and carrying more silence than most men his age. His wife, Clara, had died during a difficult second childbirth. The baby had died with her. A grave stood on the eastern rise above the claim, holding them both. In spring, wild grass grew around it. In winter, snow covered it almost completely. The chair beside the table remained empty. Dorian never moved it. He lived with his aging mother, Agnes, his 6-year-old son, Eli, and a loyal dog named Brindle. The seasons continued their work. Summers passed. Winters returned. But every cold season reminded Dorian of the same hard truth. Loss could arrive quickly, and he could not afford to bury anyone else. The cabin Dorian lived in then was nothing unusual. It was the kind of log house scattered all across Wyoming territory. Pine logs, mud chinking, a simple stove, a roof that looked solid enough from a distance, yet every winter exposed the same weaknesses. Cold air slipped through cracks too small to see. Wind found openings hidden behind furniture and beneath doors. The floor stayed cold, no matter how long the fire burned. Agnes always dragged her chair closer to the stove as the weather worsened. Eli slept beneath 2 blankets and still woke some mornings with cold cheeks. Brindle spent most nights curled beside fading coals. Dorian noticed everything. Instead of complaining, he began recording it. In a small ledger, he wrote down the number of logs burned each day. He tracked temperatures. He tracked how long the fire lasted before another load of wood was needed. Winter after winter, the numbers grew harder to ignore. The house kept demanding more, and every year, it gave less in return. One evening, after another long day of hauling firewood, Dorian opened an old cedar chest that had belonged to his father. Gideon Vale had spent much of his life building practical structures across the frontier. Spring houses, root cellars, stone milk rooms that stayed cool in summer and resisted freezing in winter. Most people remembered the buildings. Dorian remembered the lessons. Among the old belongings rested a brass plumb bob, a worn wooden measuring rule, and several pages of handwritten notes. The paper had yellowed with age. The words had not lost their meaning. One line stood out immediately. "Heat wasted is labor wasted." Dorian read the notes again the next night. Then again a few nights later. The ideas were simple. Stone, mass, shelter, patience. For the first time in years, a different possibility began to take shape inside his mind. By April of 1886, the snow had begun to retreat from the foothills. Patches of brown grass appeared across the valley. Creeks swelled with meltwater. Most settlers were preparing fences, repairing sheds, and getting fields ready for planting. Dorian chose a different project. West of the claim stood a rocky hillside covered with scattered granite and shale. The ground was uneven. The location seemed inconvenient. No sensible person would have picked it for a home. That was exactly where Dorian started working. Day after day, he hauled stone down the slope on a crude wooden sled. Some rocks were small enough to lift alone. Others demanded every bit of strength he had. The piles slowly grew. Then they grew larger. People noticed. One afternoon, a cattleman named Obadiah Flint reined in his horse and watched for a while. He looked at the stones, then at the hillside. A grin spread across his face. Building your own grave? The joke traveled faster than the project itself. Before long, people throughout the settlement were talking about the strange widower hauling enough rock to bury himself. Dorian never answered a single one of them. The stones were answer enough. He just wasn't ready to show why. Through late spring and into early summer, Dorian worked while other men shook their heads. He laid the foundation first, not on loose soil, not on soft grass. He dug down until the shovel struck hard-packed earth and stone. Then he set the first layer of granite fieldstone into a bed of clay-lime mortar. The cabin would be narrow, only 14 feet wide, but long enough to divide heat from sleeping space, 22 feet from end to end. Small by settlement standards, but every foot had a reason. The walls rose slowly. At the base, Dorian made them 28 inches thick. Higher up, he narrowed them to nearly 20 inches. The northwest wall went deeper into the hillside, nearly 4 feet against earth and rock. That buried side mattered. The ground would not make heat, but it could slow the taking of it. Dorian used flat shale where the walls needed clean courses. He used creek cobbles near the future hearth. He saved the heaviest granite slabs for the rear heat wall. Each evening, before putting away his tools, he opened the ledger. Wall thickness, soil temperature, wind direction, where frost lingered longest in the morning, where the sun struck first. None of it looked impressive from the road. To anyone passing by, it was only a strange pile of stone. But inside Dorian's mind, it was becoming a system, a low roof to trap heat, thick walls to hold it, earth behind stone to slow the cold. Not pretty, not fashionable, just patient. And patience was the one thing winter could not burn through quickly. By early summer, the walls had risen high enough for people to notice real progress. That was when the first problem appeared. One morning, Dorian walked around the cabin and stopped cold. A long crack ran through a section of mortar near the western corner, nearly 4 feet from end to end. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was enough. Several days of work had been weakened by a single mistake. The clay mixture had dried too quickly beneath a stretch of unusually hot weather. The outer surface had cured faster than the material beneath it. Word spread quickly. Obadiah Flint returned to inspect the damage. He did not even bother hiding his amusement. "Stone doesn't belong here," he said. Others agreed. Some claimed the hillside was settling. Others predicted the entire structure would split before autumn. Dorian listened. Then he picked up a hammer, removing every damaged section. Stone by stone, mortar by mortar. Hours of labor disappeared into a pile of rubble. No excuses, no arguments. When the corner was stripped clean, he mixed a new batch of mortar, adjusted the ratio, and started again. The crack had proven something important. Not that the idea was wrong. Only that winter would never forgive careless work. And Dorian had no intention of giving winter an easy victory. As the cabin continued to rise, the criticism became more serious. One afternoon, a local carpenter named Thaddeus Wren stopped beside the worksite. Unlike the others, he did not laugh. He walked slowly around the structure, studied the walls, the foundation, the slope, the unfinished roof beams. Then he began asking questions. What would happen when cooking steam filled the room? Where would damp clothing dry? How would moisture escape once winter sealed the cabin shut? Thaddeus pointed toward the stone walls. Stone held heat. That much was true. But it could also collect moisture. A cabin that trapped damp air could become just as dangerous as one that lost heat. Mold, rot, condensation, stale air. Those were the dangers he saw. Dorian listened to every word. He did not defend the design. He did not argue. That evening, after Thaddeus left, he opened the ledger and added a new section: air movement, moisture control, vent location. Over the next several days, he quietly changed parts of the plan. A narrow ventilation opening was placed high beneath the roofline. A lower escape channel was added near the opposite end of the cabin. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible from the road. But the cabin became better because of the criticism. While others were trying to win arguments, Dorian was trying to survive winter. Those were not the same thing. By late summer, the stone cabin was close enough to finished that Dorian decided it was time for a full test. The hearth was ready. The chimney was complete. The roof had been sealed. Everything looked right. Then he lit the first serious fire. At first, the flames burned clean. A few minutes later, smoke rolled back into the cabin. Not a little, a lot. Gray clouds spread beneath the ceiling. Agnes doubled over coughing. Eli rushed outside with Brindle close behind. For the first time, the project felt truly dangerous. Dorian killed the fire and began looking for answers. The problem was not the hearth, it was the hillside. During certain winds, air flowed down the slope instead of across it. The downdraft struck the short chimney and pushed smoke back inside. That night, he made more notes in the ledger. The next morning, he went back to work. The chimney was raised higher. A stone windbreak was built around the upper section. 2 days later, he tested the system again. The fire caught. Smoke rose. The draft held steady. For the first time, the cabin breathed the way it was supposed to. Winter had found another weakness, and Dorian had removed it before winter arrived. Early autumn settled over the foothills. The work was finally done. From a distance, the cabin looked strange. The roof sat low beneath a layer of buffalo grass sod. The walls were thick and heavy. Only a few small openings broke the stone. Half of the structure seemed to disappear into the hillside itself. It looked less like a home than a place meant to keep something buried. The nickname spread quickly, the tomb. Before long, nearly everyone in the settlement was calling it that. Dorian ignored them. He moved Agnes, Eli, and Brindle into the cabin and began preparing for winter. That first night, a small fire burned in the hearth. Hours later, after the flames had faded, Agnes noticed something unexpected. The farthest corner of the room was still comfortable. Not hot, not cold, just steady. Dorian opened a fresh ledger. On the first page, he wrote the date. Then he recorded the cabin's first overnight temperature reading. Outside, autumn was fading. The real test was getting closer. By late October, the cabin had already passed several tests. The walls stood firm. The chimney drafted cleanly. The interior held warmth better than any building Dorian had ever lived in. Then, another problem appeared. Not cold. Water. One morning, while making Eli's bed, Dorian noticed tiny beads of moisture along a section of stone near the sleeping area. The blanket was not soaked, but the edge felt cool and slightly damp. He knew exactly why that mattered. Months earlier, Thaddeus Wren had warned about moisture, not because stone was weak, because trapped moisture could quietly become a problem long before winter ended. Dorian did not dismiss what he saw. For 3 nights, he measured and observed. Nothing more, nothing less. Eventually, a pattern emerged. The sleeping area sat too close to the coldest section of the buried wall. Warm interior air was meeting colder stone and leaving moisture behind. The solution was simple, but only after the problem was understood. Dorian moved Eli's bed farther from the wall. He built a light screen from willow slats. He left a narrow pocket of still air behind it. A small vent opening was cut near the roofline. The drying rack was raised higher into the warmest air. Then he waited. A few nights later, the moisture was gone. Agnes noticed the change but said little. The cabin was not perfect. No structure ever was. But every weakness found before winter was one less weakness for winter to find on its own. Early November brought the first serious freeze. Not a blizzard, not a disaster. Just a single cold night that asked a simple question. Would the cabin work when it mattered? Across the settlement, lamps flickered to life after midnight as families woke to feed their stoves. Firewood disappeared one armload at a time. Dorian tried something different. He built a strong fire before bed. Then he let it burn down naturally. No fresh logs, no midnight tending, only glowing coals. When morning arrived, frost covered the ground outside. The thermometer read 6 degrees above zero. Inside the cabin, Dorian took his measurements. 49 degrees near the door, 56 near the heat wall. Agnes had slept comfortably in the far corner. Eli had never woken once. Brindle lay in the middle of the floor instead of beside the hearth. Dorian recorded every number. Nobody in the settlement knew it yet, but the stone cabin had just passed its first real examination. The successful test changed nothing about Dorian's routine. He did not celebrate. He prepared. The next several days were spent checking details that most people ignored until they became emergencies. Dry firewood remained stacked beneath shelter. The rawhide-covered door was inspected again. Vent openings were cleared. The stone windbreak around the chimney was checked for loose pieces. Flour, salt, potatoes. Water stored inside small barrels. Everything received attention. One afternoon, Agnes carefully folded Clara's old shawl and placed it back into a cedar chest. A few minutes later, Eli looked up from the table. Did Mama and the baby ever live in this cabin? For a moment, the room became very quiet. Dorian set down the axe handle he had been repairing. He thought about the question. Then he looked toward the hearth. She would have wanted it warm. Nothing more. No long explanation. A few moments later, he stepped outside and returned to splitting wood. Winter did not care about grief, but preparation could still protect the people grief had left behind. By the middle of November, the land had begun to change in ways that could not be measured with a thermometer. One afternoon, an old trapper named Ezekiel Voss rode past Dorian's claim. Ezekiel had spent decades following game trails through mountains, forests, and frozen valleys. He had survived enough winters to know that storms often announced themselves long before the first snow arrived. Unlike most visitors, he paid little attention to the cabin. He looked past it, reading the signs. Low clouds drifted across the foothills too early. The wind had shifted north. Thin ice formed across a watering trough before the sun even dropped. "This winter won't be a normal one," he said quietly. There was no drama in his voice. No attempt to frighten anyone. Just the calm certainty. Dorian listened. He respected experience, especially the kind that came from surviving things most people never faced. After Ezekiel continued on his way, the cabin felt a little quieter. That night, Dorian stayed awake longer than usual. He sharpened his axe, checked the rawhide hinges on the door, inspected the chimney windbreak one more time. Outside, the foothills settled into silence. But it was the kind of silence that often came before something much larger. Winter had not arrived yet. Still, for the first time, it felt as though it was already on its way. Winter arrived during the final days of November. No warnings, no gradual freeze, just a siege. The first day erased wagon tracks beneath deep snow. The second day brought a hard north wind that swept across the foothills and drove snow into every crack it could find. The third day froze shallow wells. Water buckets became blocks of ice before noon. Livestock huddled behind windbreaks. Fences disappeared beneath drifts. By the fourth day, the temperature had fallen to 31 degrees below zero, and kept falling. The settlement had survived bad winters before, but this was different. The storm didn't rage, it was patient. It simply moved from one weakness to the next. A loose door, a thin wall, a shallow woodpile. Wherever winter found a flaw, it extracted a toll. Across the valley, families fed their stoves and stared into the dark. Nobody spoke. The weather was no longer an inconvenience. It was a judgment. Every choice made by builders and homesteaders over the summer was now being measured, not by neighbors or pride, but by the wind. Dorian understood this. His stone cabin stood silent against the hillside as the freeze tightened. Inside, Agnes sewed beneath lamplight. Eli slept. Brindle only lifted his head when heavy gusts struck the walls. Dorian sat quietly, listening. The time for arguments was over. The testing had begun. The storm continued. Day after day, the wind kept searching, and across the settlement, weaknesses began revealing themselves. Obadiah Flint was among the first to feel the pressure. At the start of the storm, he fed his stove every 2 hours. By the second day, it was every hour. By the third, he barely trusted the fire enough to leave it alone long enough for a meal. The flames were strong. Sometimes they roared, but the warmth never stayed where it was needed. The room nearest the stove became almost uncomfortable. The far corner remained cold. Air slipped beneath the door. Heat climbed toward the ceiling. Then it disappeared through old chinking that had dried and cracked during the summer. Every armload of wood bought warmth, but only for a little while. Then the purchase had to be made again. And again. And again. Across town, Prudence Hale struggled with a different problem. Several children from nearby homesteads had been brought to the small schoolhouse because their families feared being stranded alone. The stove worked constantly. Still, cold gathered near the floorboards. One morning, Prudence noticed the ink bottle on her desk had begun to thicken. Not frozen. Not yet, but close enough to make her pause. She pushed another stick into the stove and watched the flames leap upward. The room warmed, then slowly began cooling again. The cycle never ended. Meanwhile, Barnabas Quill opened part of his general store to families needing shelter. The building was larger than most homes. That should have helped. Instead, it created new problems. More walls, more windows, more places for heat to escape. The stove burned hard, yet every evening the store felt colder than it should have. Customers arrived carrying blankets. Children huddled near barrels and crates. Wood vanished from the storage pile faster than anyone expected. Nobody lacked fire. That was the cruel part. Fire was everywhere. Stoves glowed. Flames danced. Chimneys smoked. But the heat never remained long enough to matter. It rose. It leaked. It escaped. Then it was gone. The community had warmth. What it did not have was a way to keep it. And outside, the storm continued its patient work, measuring every building one weakness at a time. While the storm kept taking from the settlement, the stone cabin responded in a different way. Dorian did not fight the weather with bigger fires. He followed the same routine he had tested before winter arrived. In the morning, 2 logs went into the hearth. The door stayed closed. The ventilation opening remained barely wide enough to keep fresh air moving. By evening, 2 more logs were added. After that, the fire was allowed to settle into glowing coals. No constant feeding. No desperate rush for more fuel. No waking every hour to keep flames alive. The work had already been done months earlier. Now the cabin was doing its part. The granite wall behind the hearth absorbed heat throughout the day. The stone floor accepted warmth slowly. But unlike air, stone did not surrender it quickly. Hours after the flames weakened, warmth still remained. Not dramatic warmth. Something better. Something steady. The air inside the cabin never swung wildly between hot and cold. It simply held. Outside, the north wind screamed across the hillside. Inside, Agnes sat near the table, quietly winding a skein of yarn. The warmth reached her where she sat. Eli slept through nights that would once have woken him. The sound of the wind no longer meant another blanket. Brindle lay between the door and the sleeping area, exactly where he preferred to be. Not pressed against the hearth, not curled beside the coals. Just watching. Guarding. Comfortable. On the 5th night of the storm, Dorian opened the ledger again. The numbers were simple. Outside temperature, -36 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature near the door, 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature beside the heat wall, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Firewood used that day. 4 logs. He studied the figures for a moment, not because they surprised him, because they confirmed what the months of work had been trying to accomplish. The crack in the mortar, the smoke problem, the moisture along the buried wall, every mistake, every correction, every measurement, all of it had led here. Dorian closed the ledger. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Outside, winter was still searching for weakness. Inside, the stone walls waited quietly around his family. And for the first time since the storm began, it seemed possible that the cabin might endure everything the season could bring. By the 5th day, fear replaced frustration. Obadiah Flint's woodpile finally ran out. He had burned too much for too little. Now, he stopped calculating days and started calculating hours. A broken chair went into the stove. then wallboards ripped from a shed, then a wooden crate. The fire burned fiercely, but the house remained hungry for heat. Across the settlement, survival meant retreat. Prudence Hale abandoned the freezing schoolhouse, dragging the children through the snow to Barnabas Quill's store. It was not much better, but at least people could gather their remaining warmth in one place. Barnabas was already rationing what little wood he had left. People huddled near barrels, wrapped in blankets, watching the flames shrink. Outside, the wind buried the town deeper. The storm stripped away autumn laughter, opinions, and pride. It left only the brutal reality of the frontier. The ultimate test wasn't how much fire a man could build. It was how much heat his house could keep. On the 6th morning, the wind finally weakened. Not enough to call it calm, just enough to make travel possible again. Ezekiel Voss left the settlement before sunrise. Several remote claims had not been seen for days. He intended to check on as many as he could before darkness returned. As he pushed through the drifts, one place kept returning to his mind: Dorian Vale's stone cabin. Not because of curiosity, because of concern. All autumn, people had joked that it looked like a tomb. Now, after nearly a week of brutal cold, Ezekiel wondered if the joke had become the truth. The climb toward the cabin was difficult. Snow reached past his knees in places. The wind still carried enough force to sting exposed skin. When he finally reached the door, everything was quiet. No smoke billowed from the chimney. No movement appeared through the small window. For a moment, the cabin looked exactly like the grave people had imagined. Then Brindle barked from inside. The latch moved. The door opened. Warm air rolled outward. Steady warmth. Ezekiel stood there longer than he intended. Inside, Agnes was pouring hot chicory coffee into a tin cup. Eli was eating a piece of reheated cornbread. A bed of glowing coals rested quietly in the hearth. Nothing felt like survival hanging by a thread. The cabin felt lived in. Ezekiel stepped inside and instinctively placed a hand against the nearest stone wall. The surface was warm. Not stove-hot, something stranger. The kind of warmth that had been there for hours. The kind that intended to stay. He looked toward Dorian. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Dorian nodded toward the room. "Come in before the wind turns." Ezekiel still staring at the wall, still feeling the heat beneath his hand. Outside, winter continued its work. Inside, the stone cabin had already delivered its answer. When Ezekiel returned to the settlement, people listened. At first, they listened politely. Then they doubted him. A warm cabin after 6 days of brutal cold sounded unlikely. A stone cabin sounded impossible. Some believed Ezekiel had exaggerated what he saw. Others suggested Dorian must have burned an enormous amount of wood. Barnabas Quill was not interested in opinions. He preferred records, measurements, numbers. When the weather eased enough to travel safely, he carried a thermometer to Dorian's cabin and asked permission to test the claims himself. Dorian agreed. The measurements were taken 3 times. In the morning, at midday, and hours after the fire had settled into coals. Outside, the temperature remained below 20 degrees under zero. Inside, the numbers told a different story. 58 degrees near the door, 64 in the center of the room, 69 beside the heat wall. Barnabas checked each reading twice. Then Dorian opened the ledger. The entries stretched back for months. Dates, temperatures, fuel usage, repairs, observations. For the 6 days of the storm, the total was simple. 23 logs, no more, no less. By comparison, Obadiah Flint had burned more than 60, and when the woodpile began failing, furniture and scrap lumber had followed. Barnabas wrote everything down. Then he stopped speaking. The room grew quiet. Because there are moments when numbers become stronger than arguments, and everyone present knew they had just reached one of them. Barnabas's ledger proved the heat. But a few days later, Thaddeus Wren returned to look for the hidden costs. The carpenter didn't come to argue. He came to inspect. He ran his hands along the stone, searching for the dampness he had predicted. He looked for mold. checked for water stains, sniffed for trapped smoke. He found nothing. Finally, he stopped at the western corner, where the long crack had appeared over the summer. The repaired mortar held firm. Thaddeus stood there a long time. He had been right to warn about moisture, but completely wrong about what this cabin could overcome. He turned to Dorian. "I was wrong. No excuses. No condition. Just the hard truth of a craftsman." Dorian nodded once. Nothing more was needed. The stone had already spoken for them both. Spring arrived slowly after the deadliest winter most people could remember. Snow retreated from the valleys. Creeks began moving again. Wagons returned to roads that had vanished for months. And across the settlement, something unexpected happened. People started building, not copies of Dorian's cabin. Something more important. They started copying the ideas behind it. Every claim was different. Some families had stone. Others had timber. Some had money to spare. Most did not. The solutions varied. The principles did not. Obadiah Flint was among the first to change. The ranch bunkhouse he rebuilt that spring included a thick stone wall on the north side. The roofline sat lower than before. The entrance was set deeper into the structure to keep wind from reaching the sleeping area. Months earlier, he would have laughed at such choices. Now he measured them. Prudence Hale made changes as well. The schoolhouse gained a masonry heat wall beside the stove. The room warmed more slowly, but it stayed warm longer after classes ended. The children never knew why the building felt different. Prudence did. At Barnabas Quill's store, another change appeared. Fewer customers asked about larger stovepipes. More asked about lime, clay, masonry tools, thermometers. People wanted measurements now, not traditions repeated without question. Even Thaddeus Wren changed. He did not abandon woodworking. Instead, he began combining wood and stone whenever the job allowed. Timber for structure, mass for heat retention, ventilation for moisture control. One material doing what it did best. The lesson spread farther than the cabin itself, because the thing people copied was never the building. It was the thinking. For generations, most settlers had asked one question: how much heat can this stove make? After that winter, many began asking a different one. How much heat can this house keep? The answer changed homes. It changed fuel usage. It changed winter planning. Most of all, it changed the way people looked at cold. The storm had not taught them to admire stone. It had taught them to respect proven wisdom. And that lesson lasted far longer than the snow. Dorian never called the cabin a success, nor did he correct its nickname. The tomb remained the tomb. Years passed. The sod roof needed patching. The wooden door was eventually replaced, but the thick stone walls stood unmoved. Inside, life simply went on. Quiet. Steady. The stone never spoke. Neither did the winter. Yet together, they left behind a permanent verdict. Most of the frontier believed bigger fires were the answer to the cold. Dorian built upon a truth the frontier had forgotten. Heat kept is worth more than heat made. When the deadliest storm in memory swept across the valley, it tested every wall, every woodpile, and every man's pride. But when it reached the cabin on the hillside, it found too few weaknesses to take the family inside. That was why the laughter finally stopped. Not because Dorian won an argument, but because nature itself had examined the work and delivered the judgment for him.